Right, greetings, hello again. This is Dr Thomas Daffern again for my weekly philosophy club here at Betet, in the middle of France, in La Creuse, which is a secret part of the centre of France. No one's ever heard of it. I'd never really heard of it before I moved here, so it's best kept secret of France. Okay, so we're going to be looking again at dyads, at relationships, creative relationships between different traditions in the history of philosophy and religions. And we're going to be looking at the esoteric traditions, particularly in relation to other ones, which should be quite interesting. I'm going to start again, as I did last week, by looking at some of the books I use as reference guides, because what I'm sharing is based on 30, even 40 years of detailed research into these things. And most of it conducted before the internet, from books, in libraries. And I have a huge personal collection gathered over 30 years. And I've visited libraries all over the world, specialist academic libraries involved in philosophy and history of science, history of religious studies and so on. Okay, so I'm just sharing a few of these books, right? I want to start by sharing this beautiful red book that I've had for years, it's the autobiography of Carl Jung. It's called Memories, Dreams and Reflections. And it's influenced my thinking and Jung's work, which I have here in the library, the collected works. He was a great Swiss psychologist and psychiatrist who ran the psychiatric department in one of the biggest hospitals in Switzerland, just outside of Zurich. His family background were Christian, Protestant Christian, but he was very interested in the mind. Why do some people become disturbed psychologically, psychotic and so on? So he got very interested in Freud's work and went to study with him and was inspired by Freud's theories of the unconscious and his way of trying to get inside, the mind of patients in a sympathetic way, because up till that time, psychiatrists just treated mental illness as a sort of physical symptom. I mean, earlier in the medieval time, it was treated as a religious case of possession, demonic possession, and so people were often treated abominably, being chained and whipped and God knows what, because they were thought to be possessed by demons. And if the exorcism failed, then they were just left to rot in very disturbed circumstances. They might also be accused of witchcraft or dabbling with demons, So anyway, then along came the scientific revolution, and people said, no, these people are not like that. They're just disturbed. Something's gone wrong in the brain structure. Something's gone wrong in the mind. And let's treat them with this pill or that pill, or, this physical therapy. Freud said, no, let's actually treat the mind as a mind and try and understand what's going on in their thought processes. They've got stuck somewhere. Maybe in their evolution into full adulthood, they got stuck in a loop kind of thing. Jung found Freud's theories useful, but then he felt they fixated too much on the sexual evolution of humans. Freud thought that that's the key thing that can either make or break us. And Jung felt that although obviously sexuality is very important to the psyche, it's not the only thing. And there are other factors that come in, spiritual factors, and all kinds of things. He was very interested in the study of dreams and the study of archetypes, myths, legends, religious images, art history. And from all this, Jung pieced together his own kind of map of the psyche. And it's all given in his book, his autobiography, which is really, really important to read. And one can draw interesting inspiration from it. And his theories of the unconscious being a kind of the personal unconscious, where I go when I sleep or dream, is my personal unconscious. But then I can plug into what's called the collective unconscious by Jung. I can plug into the same thought field that Buddha could plug into, or Christ, or Muhammad, or whoever, because it's out there, the collective unconscious. And when I discovered that the Buddhists had been saying exactly the same 2,500 years before Jung, they called it the alaya vijnana, the collective storehouse consciousness. So when you enter deep meditation, you can plug into that collective consciousness or unconscious. And, so that inspired me a lot. And I just want to say this stands for all the collected works of Jung, which should be here, but I couldn't bring them down. And it inspired my work in transpersonal history. So I've combined Jung's theories of transpersonal psychology, that there are sort of patterns and archetypes behind events. They're not random. There's synchronicities. There's a meaning in life, which is made known to us by synchronicities and by our intuition and by our dreams and so on. I've combined that theory with historical scientific research into the nature of history, especially the history of ideas, which is my particular love and passion, which I'm sharing in this philosophy club. So anyway, there's Jung. Another book I want to share is, this is a dictionary of philosophy and religion, which is very well battered, as you can see. It's been very well loved and well used over the last 20 years. It's, I think, the best single volume dictionary for philosophy and religious studies by a man called W.L. Rees, who comes from a school of thought called process philosophy, associated with a man called Hartshorne, who's, I think, one of the best of American philosophers, who was a professor at Harvard and an expert in the history of ideas, who process philosophy basically says that existence is a movement. It's an activity. Being is a verb. We shouldn't forget that. So the human soul, the human mind, is constantly under evolution. We're growing. It's in movement. Literally everything in the known universe is in movement. From the tiniest little particles in the atoms, the cells, up to our forms. Without movement, there's death. I'm only alive because I'm breathing, because my heart's beating, and because my neurons are moving, and my voice is moving, and so on and so on. So movement is life. Is it possible that God, or the gods, or the supernatural beings that seem to have created us, said Hartshorne, are also evolving? Why can't these gods also be in some kind of evolutionary scale that we can't even comprehend? They'd be like super conscious beings, like angelic beings and so on. But surely they're learning too. Maybe this whole planet is a sort of learning experience, not just for us humans who are here, but also for the gods themselves, who are kind of watching it and learning. Oh dear, those dinosaurs I created, that was a bit of a mistake. They all ate each other and were horrible. So I'm not doing that again next time I get to create a world. Maybe there are super creative intelligences having those kind of conversations. That's what Hartshorne dared to say, because it fits in with discoveries about evolutionary science. Of course, back in the day, 500-600 years ago, when the Bible was taken as the literal word of God, creation all just begins at once, and the one God does it just like that, 4000 BC. So there's no sort of evolution going on. God is perfect straight off, and the world is supposed to be perfect, but our ancestors screwed it all up. Well, that theory, said Hartshorne, seems to be outdated and outmoded by scientific discoveries. The planet's been around 4,000 million years, which is a huge amount of time, and life forms have been on the planet for at least 3,500 million years. In simple little cell forms. And we humans have been around in our human form for at least about 200,000 years, which is an awfully much longer time than the Bible chronology. So therefore, maybe we need a sort of process theology. That's what Hartshorne said. And then one of his friends wrote this amazing encyclopedia. It's not promoting that idea. It's an objective scientific study of all schools of thought and philosophy, such as is my table. Another book I want to highlight is this amazing book by Manly P. Hall, who was an American, well, actually Canadian like me, philosopher, an esoteric thinker, who was active in the sort of early part of the 20th century through to the mid to late 20th century. And he was a bit like me, actually, absolutely fascinated by esoteric thought. He was a bit of a polymath. He studied everything he could get his hands on. Amassed a huge library of particularly esoteric writings like alchemical stuff, theosophical stuff, and Freemasonic stuff. He himself became a Freemason. He worked in New York, and then he got an amazing job where his patron gave him a blank check to go around the whole of Europe and gather all the kind of esoteric books that he could find in bookshops and private collections and auctions and things. And he came back to Los Angeles with a huge collection of these books, which then were put in a special library in Los Angeles called the Philosophical Research Society, which is right there by Hollywood. It's open, you can go and attend lectures and stuff. There's about 40,000 books there, I believe, even bigger than my library. And yeah, that was Manly P. Hall. And then he wrote this book, which is a summation and synthesis. It's called The Secret Teachings of All Ages. And it's a survey of all the esoteric thinking. He goes into depth in the ancient mysteries, Mithraic studies, Druid studies, esoteric Christianity, the Gnostic traditions, the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, and Platonic thought, and Egyptian, Islamic, and so on. So in a sense, he hits lots of the boxes of the table, going into real detail. I read through the entire book, for the second time about a year ago, because I applied for the job as director of that society in Los Angeles. I thought it'd be fun. They gave it to a local lad, so I didn't get that particular job. Hi to my friends in Los Angeles. Okay, so that's important. I want to say also this book is quite unique. This is a smaller book, but it's one I wrote a few years ago called Enlightenments, and this arose out of a lecture I was asked to give at the Pagan Federation in Shrewsbury. We had a conference and I was invited to give a talk, and I said, okay, I'll do it on enlightenments, plural, because pagans don't believe in just one answer, one enlightenment. They affirm there are many gods, not just one god, and there are many religions, and that's fine, and no one of them is necessarily better or wiser than the others. They exist in a kind of a fluid dynamic process of mutual evolution. Just as we humans are not made of just one type of atom, we have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, all the different metals, trace elements in the one body that makes us human. So the world has all these different elements, spiritual elements too, says paganism. So I asked, well, okay, so let's talk about enlightenments, plural, instead of just enlightenment. And let's say, how does a Buddhist enlightenment differ to, say, a Hindu or a Christian or an Islamic or a Jain or a Shinto or a pagan? And I went through, this was before I created the table, but it's the sort of thinking that led up to it. I went through all the different traditions. I was teaching as a full-time teacher of religious studies at the time. And I wrote this in my spare time in the holidays and weekends, coming back from school. And I asked, what is enlightenment? If we can't agree on the model, then the planet can hardly agree on a common narrative on how we're going to get there. I mean, the United Nations wants to save the planet from mutual self-destruction. But if we got Putin versus China versus America versus NATO versus Europe versus Ukraine versus Islam versus Netanyahu and Judaism versus Brexit Britain and crazy Christianity, or whatever you want to call it, all pulling in different directions because they have different views of the future and where they want to go to. We're not going to get there because we don't know where we're headed. I once went to a very important summit organised by the United Nations in Copenhagen called the World Summit for Social Development, 29 years ago, in fact. And the minister for the Cyprus government spoke. He quoted a Greek philosopher saying, to the sailor who does not know his direction, all winds are unfavourable. You know, you've got to know where you're going if you're a sailor on a ship, a master mariner, to be able to point the ship in the right direction and head off there. If you don't know where you're going, you just like go round in circles and get blown by the winds. So that's what enlightenment is about. So in a sense, what I did in this book is I looked at what would become all the boxes of the table. And I asked, well, okay, so what's your final ultimate goal? Where are you going? If you're a Zen Buddhist, you know, what will enlightenment look like? Will it mean that, okay, you drop your body and become a void? Do you like float in free space, or do you just dissolve and become like nothingness? Is that your ideal of where you're going? Or is something going to remain of you know, the essence of you, and so where and how? And how long will it take to get there? How many lifetimes and incarnations? And it seems a bit odd if the master plan of God, or the Creator, is you're going to have hundreds of lives on earth experiencing tremendous suffering, pain, some joy, but a lot of suffering, again and again and again, till you finally get out of the game and become a void nothingness and disappear. It doesn't seem much of a prize to work towards, does it? You know, so we might want to visit that theory of enlightenment, which is what I did in this book. And then I counterposed that with, say, the Islamic views, the Jain, the Hindu, and the Christian, where you kind of go to a heaven. I think the Christian view of enlightenment is you go to a heaven, which is a very beautiful place, and you get to be there for eternity, experiencing all kinds of spiritual experiences. That's quite similar to the Muslim idea. And even the Jain one is similar. You retain your lessons that you've learned in your incarnations. You take them to a paradise realm where all those lessons are sort of, you know, all what you've learned carries on. So anyway, it's quite seminal, this book. And recently I gave a year-long course with my friend Satyen Raja called Enlightenments, where we went into it in even more detail than this book. And we're working on a second edition of the book as a result. Okay, so then there's this very exciting book I want to share, which is called the Biographical Encyclopedia, A to Z, of transpersonal theorists, historians, psychologists and philosophers between 1945 to 2001. Now, this was an appendix to my PhD thesis at the University of London. I published it separately as a volume because I purposely designed it to be a study aid for people that are researching after I've gone, after I'm, you know, and they don't want to have to repeat the wheel, right? So I did this as an A to Z encyclopedia, so you can look up all these interesting thinkers that I'm talking about, the ones that lived in the latter part of the 20th century, because, of course, I would have done an encyclopedia for all cultures, all historical periods, but you can't do that for a PhD. You have to narrow down, so I made it 50 years long. And they're all in here. It was a huge amount of work, but really fun. And I use it a lot for my own reference when I'm preparing classes and talks and stuff. And a lot of them are found in the different boxes. And by transpersonal theorists and thinkers, I mean people that are interested in scientific studies, history, philosophy and so on, but also want that value-added je ne sais quoi of the spiritual, esoteric. And it was a phrase coined by Carl Jung, okay, the transpersonal. And then Talk to the Devil, here we have a kind of dictionary of transpersonal psychologies edited by Charles Tart, which goes into the details of the higher forms of thinking of these different traditions. There's chapters on Sufism, on Gurdjieff, on yoga, on Zen Buddhism, and so on. You know, it's Charles Tart is a master of that field. I also just want to mention this book as an example this is a biography. It happens to be about Gandhi. But I have hundreds and hundreds of biographies in the library because as a historian, biographies, I mean, it was Carlyle that said all history is a series of biographies. I mean, it's what human beings do individually and collectively that moves history forward. And the great thinkers and visionary seers that populate the table, they all have biographies. Not all of which have been written, but many have. And Gandhi, I have quite a few biographies of Gandhi because I used to work as the educational director for the Gandhi Foundation in London for about 8 years. And I worked with people that had known Gandhi. I worked from the, like an ashram in the East End of London, Kingsley Hall, where Gandhi himself visited and stayed in 1931. And I got very interested in Gandhi. I used to teach, we created a school of non-violence, looking at Gandhi's work as a teacher of non-violence. And I went all over the country running classes and courses in non-violence for them, which got me deeply into Gandhian studies. And I discovered, he was deeply influenced and inspired by esoteric thinkers. He was in London, at the University of London, studying law, where I was a graduate. And he met Helena Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society, who was then in London at the end of her life. She'd been off studying mysticism and magic in Tibet and meeting masters of wisdom. And Gandhi was blown away and he joined the Theosophical Society. But he wasn't so much interested in philosophy, unlike me. He was more of an activist. And he then embarked on his career as a non-violence practitioner, first in South Africa and later back in India, where he led the Indian independence movement, really, out of which grew the Congress Party, which was an ecumenical, liberal, progressive force for Indian independence. But the kind of India they wanted to create was an India based on tolerance, fairness, justice for all. No religion would be persecuted. Unfortunately, the current India we've got is not led by them. It's led by another political party, the BJP, who are from the opposite wing of extreme Hinduism. And they tend towards a sort of unilateral, neo-fascistic view of Hinduism, that Hinduism's the best religion. And, the only boxes that should be on the chart are the yellow Hindu boxes. And they're issuing death threats against Muslims and treating the Muslims of Kashmir very badly. This is all in the mind of the BJP government, which is run secretly by a thing called the RSS, which is a neo-fascist organisation. And it's that body earlier which actually killed Gandhi. The guy that assassinated him, a man called Bose, was an agent of this fascist Hindu thing. And they hated Gandhi because he believed in peace, like me, and tolerance and interfaith harmony. He was on his way to an interfaith prayer meeting when he was killed by this crazy fanatic. And they hated him because he said, no, India should be open to all faiths. Well, I believe with Gandhi's vision, that that's the kind of India I want. And indeed, that's the kind of world I want. And so far, I've avoided being assassinated, so that's good. But, it's a brilliant biography, and the author, Catherine Tidrick, talks about his meetings with Blavatsky and so on. And that inspired Martin Luther King, who was an expert on Gandhi and on nonviolence, who did his own PhD in the University of Boston, much later in the 50s and 60s. And I was once on a train in America, and I met this chap who knew all the details of Martin Luther King's life. And he told me that they were just publishing the collected works of Martin Luther King, including his early essays, which were all about Gnosticism, Theosophy, Universalism, and Gandhian approaches to esoteric wisdom. This was the Christian minister, Martin Luther King, and he was inspired in his nonviolence by this example. So that's a really precious thing. I've got biographies of Martin as well. Okay, coming to the end. Theosophy comes up quite a lot in my studies. It's a word for esoteric wisdom, divine wisdom. There's philosophy, we love it, it's great, but Theosophy is going to a higher level, it's divine wisdom. And it was a term coined by Ammonius Saccas in Alexandria, in Egypt, founded by Alexander the Great, who was himself a pretty wise intellectual, actually. So this is a Theosophical Encyclopedia, which I bought in India at the Theosophical Society headquarters. It's printed in Manila. I brought it all the way back from India, and it's amazing. It's got detailed articles about all the great theosophists of history, and hats off to the people that produced it. And one of the things about Theosophy is it's very complicated terminology. You know, what do these terms mean? When you first read Blavatsky's work, you fall into a sea of unknown language. Well, this, you can look all the terms up, and it explains it. Okay, and then there's this encyclopedia of occultism and parapsychology. This also is an amazing 2-volume work. I've got both volumes. A to Z of everybody who's who in esoteric thought, occultism, broadly defined, and parapsychology. So the study of the mind, of paranormal phenomena. I mean, you know, like levitation. I think I might have shared in a previous meeting about Thomas Aquinas, you know, reputed to have levitated during his amazing vision of seeing the ultimate truth behind the universe. And several saints in the Catholic tradition have been known to levitate. Well, they're in here, and people are studying the phenomena. You know, it's a bit weird, isn't it, flying about. But there was one particular saint in Italy who used to fly about the church, and it was hard to get him back down. Now, how does that work? You know, this is the sort of those sorts of things are studied. Also, telepathy, and all the scientists that are studying this stuff. You know, it's an amazing resource, and inspires that to some extent. And then we have my own little contribution, which is called Magical Peacemaking, a handbook of skills for practitioners and theoreticians. I wrote this during lockdown a couple of years ago, and it's the first ever book about peace magic that I know of in the history of the world. I don't know why, you know, but there we are. Nobody's thought of it. There are two things, aren't there? There's magical studies, broadly defined, meaning anything that's slightly exciting and paranormal and interesting. The term comes from Zoroastrianism, meaning someone that works with Ahura Mazda, the highest wisdom energy, someone who's on the side of the divine light, a magus or a mage. And the term magic is what they do, you know, which is creating miraculous effects to advance the evolution of humanity in a forward positive direction. So this is a book of, if you want, white magic, universally applied to the quest for peace. You can get endless handbooks on love magic, sex magic, how to make money and become a millionaire magic. You can get books on how to win races and become a great runner type of magic. You know, it's all to do with the mind control and things. This is the first ever book about peace magic. It's inventing a whole new genre. How can we use our faculties and powers? You know, Buddha said, yes, we have all these transpersonal powers, things like telepathy, but they're dormant in most of us. If we activate them, well then how can we use them for peace? I mean, so that's what this book is about. It's a year-long study course. And yeah, it was great fun to read, to write. And it's been very interesting to live. And then lastly, and then I'll move on, this is the book that goes with the table. So, you know, if you get the table, get your school or university to order it, put it on the wall of the classroom. If you're a teacher, get it definitely, you know, in your classroom. And then you can use it for teaching purposes. And it's on the internet, so you can then use a data projector to show it. And you can then get the book, which comes with it. And then you can look up all the details of what I'm talking about here. And it's a simple but really profound and deep guide to all these religious and philosophical traditions, which nobody has yet managed to put into this format before. Nobody's thought of it. Okay, so those are some of the books that I'm using. I just wanted to share that lot before we start, because I think it's exciting. and it explains really where I'm coming from. Okay, right. So over to you. Let's go for our first dyad here.
Okay, so the first box gonna be esoteric, like plant,
Right.
and it's gonna be 1, 2, 3 Theosophy,
Oh, okay. Well, there we are. Talk of the devil. Yeah.
and next to that, tuk tuk tuk. Okay, Primal American Indian.
Okay. Right. Well, I think I'm going to bring my book, my Encyclopedia of Theosophy back. So let's start with the oldest one, because that's a pattern that's quite good. I'll start with the American Indian one. So I was born in Canada. And I remember as a young boy growing up in Montreal, we were very conscious as a family of the American Indian culture. We had a book about Ishi, who was the last real Indian of a Californian Indian tribe, who very, very moving story of his life story. And I remember learning about, it was just in my blood to know these things. Here was a very ancient people that pre-existed the coming of Europeans to America. And although we were living in French Quebec, and the French had been there 400 years, and the British came, not long after, the native peoples had been there for millennia before. So there was always a great respect in my family to the native peoples. But when I was educated back in England, we moved back to England when I was small, we didn't really learn much about American Indian religion, certainly. It was something that I studied privately and independently later on. And I got very interested in it. It was the 70s when people were beginning to explore these things. I remember coming across the works of Carlos Castaneda in my teens, who was an anthropologist that studied with a Mexican shaman called Don Juan, and I thought this was amazing stuff. They were practicing, advanced magical consciousness development, and he was reporting it as an anthropologist. So I realized the American Indian culture had many great mysteries. And later, I studied it academically. And in fact, I read out a saying from a leader of the Blackfoot Indians at my father's funeral when he died when I was 17. We only had like a couple of minutes each, the 3 children, and I was the youngest. And I wanted to say something very short and sweet. And I, looked in the Bible, couldn't find anything, looked in the other scriptures, and then I found this scripture, North American Indian, and he said simply, what is life? Life is like the breath of a buffalo in the wintertime. Life is like the shadow at sunset that scuttles across the grass and is gone. It was just a very short saying about how precious life is because it's so short and transient. And you think when you're young, when I was 17 or whatever, that it was going to last forever. And one never thinks one is mortal. But it is short. And so that saying, and I kind of instinctively knew that from childhood. I think because my father died when I was so young. So later, when I was teaching at the University of London, I began teaching religious studies at a course, at Birkbeck College, and I got very interested in primal religions, which is the technical name for these religions. And the box of the American Indian religions is up the top, one of these primal religions.